Mike Tyson doesn't hand out compliments easily, and that's exactly why his recent comments about Jake Paul turned so many heads. In a wide-ranging conversation, the former heavyweight champion said plainly that Paul is skilled enough, not because of hype or headlines, but because he keeps winning. Tyson's point was simple. Even if critics insist Paul isn't facing elite contenders, those opponents should still be beating him if they're truly better. They aren't. So the results on paper demand a certain level of respect. In Tyson's view, you don't have to love Jake Paul's path into boxing to acknowledge what he's done since entering the ring. The man keeps finding ways to win, and that counts. Asked if he would ever fight Paul, Tyson gave a knowing smile and admitted he hadn't taken the idea seriously in the past. But then he added something that sounded like a door opening just a crack. That could be very interesting. When pressed on whether Paul is good enough to make a matchup worth considering, Tyson didn't hedge. He's skilled enough. I'm going to give it to him, Tyson said. He circled back to the same argument. If the opponents lined up against Paul were as solid as fans claim, they would have solved the puzzle by now. They haven't. That reality puts a different shade on Paul's resume. Tyson wasn't saying Paul is the best boxer at his weight or the most accomplished striker in the sport. He was saying that Paul has beaten a number of guys most expected would outclass him, and that's a credit you can't simply wave away. That backdrop makes the next chapter of Jake Paul's career even more intriguing because it coincides with a major shift in how fans watch fights. Paul has touted the streaming era as the new home for big-time boxing, and Netflix's willingness to step in as a broadcast partner underscores that shift. The pattern has been repeating across sports for a few years. Live events moving from traditional TV and pay-per-view to global platforms that already command huge audiences. In this case, Netflix pushed further into combat sports by hosting a major fight card, a development many old-school fans considered unthinkable a decade ago. Like it or not, this is where the sport is heading. The conversation around that move quickly turned into a broader debate about the business of boxing. Piracy has kneecapped pay-per-view for years. Consumers are cost-conscious. Younger audiences don't buy cable. And the idea of free fights included with a monthly subscription is well suited to an era built on binge-watching and shared logins. Within that context, Paul positioned himself not just as a fighter, but as a promoter who understands the new marketplace. He even referred to the evolution in eras, the TV era, the pay-per-view era, and now the streaming era, suggesting that the fights themselves will change as the distribution model changes. Things may get weird, he warned, but the upside is undeniable when a platform with Netflix's reach decides to bring boxing to millions who rarely watch the sport. The banter around Paul's potential opponents often veers from serious analysis to locker room-style rhythm. At one point, a producer teased the idea of what might happen if two personalities on set actually went at it in real life. Today, right now, if it goes down, who's winning? Someone asked. The exchange hummed with nervous laughter and bravado, and the punchline was predictable. Size and edge matter. In the case of Jake Paul, that size has been a recurring theme. He's naturally bigger than many of the fighters he's been linked with in fantasy matchups, a reality that always shapes the conversation. Tyson's own perspective on Paul's power added heft to the debate. At one point, Tyson admitted he didn't remember every detail of a shared ring session, joking that he blanked out a little, but he remembered how he felt afterward. His body was sore, chest, stomach, everything. This is Tyson we're talking about, a man who has shared the ring, sparred, and fought with some of the heaviest hitters in boxing history. Casual praise does not come from him often. For Tyson to say that Paul's punches registered, that he felt them the next day, was a moment that shifted opinion beyond hashtags and hot takes. It also validated the training commitment Paul has talked about for years, the strength work, and the focus on fundamentals. The message was clear. Whatever else you think of his resume, Jake Paul's power isn't a myth manufactured by viral clips. It's real. That doesn't mean every analyst is sold on a matchup like Jake Paul versus Gervonta "Tank" Davis. Mike Perry, never shy about stating his views, came down hard on the idea. He questioned whether Tank is still the knockout artist he once was, the wrecking ball who blew through opponents and left highlight reel chaos behind. Perry's take was that Davis might not love the grind of boxing the same way anymore, and that matters when you're staring down a bigger, heavier, naturally stronger opponent. He emphasized the physics of it all. If a man enters the ring with a massive weight advantage, that discrepancy changes how punches land, how much punishment each fighter can absorb, and how stamina drips away over rounds. Size doesn't decide everything in boxing, but it's not a trivial line on a tail-of-the-tape graphic either. This leads to the reality at the center of the discussion. Paul is a big man for the divisions Tank Davis has dominated. Talk of an 80 or 100-pound advantage makes purists wince for a reason. Boxing is built on the respect for weight classes. It's how the sport keeps contests fair and competitive, and matchups that leap over those boundaries carry an unavoidable sense of imbalance. We're not talking about a 10-pound gap that can be negotiated. We're talking about divisions apart. Alongside the back and forth, the conversation veered briefly to fantasy matchups outside the Paul Davis orbit. When asked who would win between Canelo Alvarez and Terence Crawford, a voice in the mix didn't hesitate: Mexican power. It was an answer that reminded everyone how subjective these debates can be even among dedicated fans and analysts. Style, size, timing, and trajectory all play into the way people line up on either side of a hypothetical fight. Trainer Greg Hackett offered a refreshing counterpoint to the more heated takes about Davis considering a fight with Paul. He didn't frame it as a sign of decline or desperation. He framed it as business. Prize fighting has always been about two currencies, legacy and money, and often the two collide. Hackett reminded listeners that there is no shame in a great fighter chasing a great payday. Opportunities don't last forever, and critics rarely help cover the bills when a fighter's career winds down. In his words, Davis could collect a check and then return to fighting the names fans want to see. That doesn't diminish what he has accomplished at lightweight. It doesn't shut the door on future title fights. It just signals a choice that thousands of fighters before him have made when the numbers were right. That sense of realism ran into a wall of old-school skepticism from former champion Timothy Bradley. He didn't mince words. For Bradley, the thought of a naturally 200-plus-pound athlete facing an elite lightweight has all the credibility of a circus attraction. He argued that televised spectacles like this cheapen boxing's reputation by edging away from the sport's core principle of fair competition within weight classes. In his eyes, this is less about the art of boxing and more about promotion. And that matters to people like Bradley, who came up in the trenches of the sport and prized the craft and discipline it demands. When he says he can't stand what Jake Paul represents in this context, he's voicing a common frustration among traditionalists who fear that attention and revenue are replacing merit and matchmaking. Another analyst, Showbiz the Adult, cut through the chatter with a blunt technical breakdown. He acknowledged Tank Davis's talent, but drew a sharp line between skill and output. Davis is a counterpuncher by nature, not a volume machine. That's key when you're trying to bank rounds against a bigger man who can smother you, reset you, and make you carry his weight. Showbiz even used a hypothetical. If Jake Paul somehow faced a prime Manny Pacquiao, the activity gap would make Paul's size less relevant because Pacquiao's in-and-out rhythm and relentless combinations collect points. With Davis, Showbiz suggested, the relatively low punch count may leave the door open for Paul to impose himself physically. It's not an automatic recipe for a Paul win, but it's a path that exists, and it's based on style, not star power. Skeptics have also seized on recent performances to question Davis's knockout aura. They point to a night when he struggled to put a smaller opponent away. Lamont Roach's name entered the conversation as an example of how hard it can be to impose power when everything else isn't clicking. If Davis couldn't seriously hurt a man he outweighed and outskilled on paper, then how does he land the kind of decisive shot that turns a much bigger, sturdier fighter's lights out? It's a fair question, even if you believe Davis is still one of the most dangerous finishers in the lower divisions. Power isn't just about explosiveness. It's about the transfer of force into a body that can or cannot absorb it. Against a natural cruiser-sized athlete, that equation changes. Between the analysis and the hot takes, fans did what fans always do. They argued, speculated, and appointed winners months in advance. Some insisted Davis would embarrass Paul on points, dancing around him, picking him off, and walking away without a scratch. Others argued that Paul would drag Davis into deep water, lean on him, wear him down, and touch the scorecards just enough to tip the balance. Plenty split the difference and said the matchup was more about entertainment than outcome, that neither man would risk the sort of danger that could throw future paydays off track. Rising contender Bruce "Shoo Carrington approached the topic from a different angle altogether. He worried about what matchups like this mean for the health of the sport. He expressed disappointment that a big-money fight might be built around factors other than competitive parity: older foes, retired names, and opponents not at their peak. If that becomes the blueprint and wealthy backers continue to turn those blueprints into multi-million-dollar productions, What message does it send to the next generation? Will young boxers chase viral moments and spectacle instead of belts and balanced matchups? Carrington's frustration isn't unique. There's a growing sense among purists that boxing is drifting toward novelty at the expense of the craft. Not everyone in that camp wrote Paul off as a mere showman, though. Another thread in the discussion argued that Paul is motivated by legitimacy as much as money. The idea isn't that he needs an L or a W to shape a narrative, but that he wants the kind of opponent who shifts public opinion away from scoffs and into serious debate. Fair or not, Gervonta Davis is a name that carries serious weight. He's an elite talent with highlight reel knockouts and a reputation for hurting men who get it wrong by half an inch. If Paul were to fight him and either win or make it uncomfortable for 12 rounds, that would change how people talk about him. It would also change how people talk about the celebrity-to-boxer pipeline in general. In some corners, the conversation turned on a single question: what would it take for Jake Paul to be considered legit? Some said beating Davis outright would be enough. Others said pushing him to a close decision would be a watershed moment, something like Rocky I, where the point wasn't who won, but who belonged. And then there were those who simply said legitimacy is earned over time, fight after fight, against progressively tougher opponents. In that view, a single high-profile matchup won't rewrite opinions cemented over years. Running parallel to all of this is a point that could deflate the balloon entirely. If the event is an exhibition, it changes everything. Exhibitions aren't about belts. They aren't about rankings. They often involve shorter rounds, sometimes 2 minutes per round, modified rules, and a general understanding that neither fighter is seeking the kind of definitive statement that can derail a career. Critics of the Paul Davis idea highlighted this distinction. To them, the exhibition label drains the matchup of real intrigue. You can still enjoy it as entertainment, they said, but you should temper your expectations. Don't look to an exhibition to answer questions about supremacy or legacy. Even with that caveat, the cultural conversation refuses to slow down. Boxing is in a transitional era. Streaming platforms are rewriting revenue models. Hybrid cards blend celebrity bouts with rising prospects and veteran showcases. The boundaries between sport and spectacle blur when the lights go up and the cameras hum. It's the same impulse that has driven boxing for over a century, a mix of glitz and grit, but the scale is different now. A social media clip can do more to build a fight than a year's worth of careful matchmaking used to do. And a single partnership with a streaming giant can introduce a fighter to an audience far beyond the die-hard boxing community. And don't forget Tyson's parting logic: if a fighter keeps winning, he's earned a certain amount of credit. If critics believed the opponents weren't worthy, those opponents still had their chance to prove it. They didn't. The next test, if it happens, will ask different questions about size, output, and whether a counterpuncher can make a bigger man pay for walking into the wrong pocket. Until then, the debate will rage: Jake Paul's power and platform against Gervonta Davis's skill and name. It's a story about boxing's present, its streaming future, and the old truths the sport refuses to forget.